What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Welcome back to another Friday over here at Level Effect. Good to see everyone. Good to see everyone inside of the chat. Got an exciting stream here today. Another guest instructor stream. Check out who's hanging out over here. We got a decent sized crowd already to kick things off. Nice, nice, nice. How's everyone doing? Nice. Jordan, Bearded, Bleedus. Good to see you. It's been a while. It's been it feels like a long time since we've hung out. Karina, Patricia. I wonder who J Security is. I wonder who that is. Nice. Matt, yeah, good to see you. I know, seeing a lot of you too today, actually. Interestingly enough. Nice. Just a couple of hours. That's rightfully it is. You haven't got fired, so doing good. You know what? Any week we haven't gotten ourselves fired is a good week, I think, Bearded. So good stuff. Good to have you back with us. Cool. Okay, well, I've got an exciting introduction over here today. We've got a special stream. We've got one of our new instructors on the team, Johnny Johnson. He's actually an instructor over here now at Level Fact. He's going to be working on a new course, which we're going to tease a little bit about today. But Johnny has been in the industry for a while now, coming up to, I think, about a decade in experience. Ton of experience from the detection engineering side. He's currently the principal Windows security researcher over at Huntress. So quite a lot of responsibility with a role like that. That wasn't his first principal role either. So he was over at Prelude before that as principal security engineer, senior security researcher of adversarial techniques and capabilities over at Binary Defense. He was hosting his own cybersecurity related podcast in the past as well. And I think you're going to enjoy a lot of what he has to say. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to bring him on streaming here in just a second. I hope you're all excited. I'm looking forward to this myself. There's going to be a lot to unpack. I think Johnny does a really good job of describing detection engineering and alert classification in a way that I haven't seen before, just kind of looking at his content. So I think you're going to get a lot out of this. Without further ado, let's go and bring Johnny onto the stream. Johnny, good to have you with us. Welcome, welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me this Friday. How's the weather up there in Toronto?
Weather's not bad. It's a little frosty over here. We got a big dump of snow. We actually had so much snow, like the buses were canceled, and we have another storm coming in on Sunday. Yeah, man. How about you?
I know. Well, for us, I mean, I'm in South Carolina, so it's bright, sunny. Right. I think it's like 65 degrees. I have some friends up there in Syracuse, New York, and they are snowed out right now. So do not envy you whatsoever right now.
That's right. We're feeling that pain of your friends up there in the north with us.
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. Well, everyone in chat, please give Johnny a big welcome over here to the stream. As I mentioned, he's one of our new instructors on the team, and he's working on some new content, ton of experience in today's and talk a lot about alert, evaluation, classification. So please, everyone, give him a big shout. Welcome him to Level Effect stream. We're gonna try to steal him for some more streams too in the future. So this won't be the last.
Yeah, I'm hoping to be on here quite a bit and do some cool webinars, talk about some cool SOC, detection engineering processes. So super stoked to be here, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to dive into some alert classification stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, really good to have you.
Cool. So are you ready for me to share and start going?
I think just a moment. Yeah, just to kind of see if anyone in chat, anything that anyone wants to cover with Johnny before we dive into things, or if you want, we can just go right into the content. Either one's good. Give everyone a minute. Drink some coffee along the way too.
For all those listening to, I just found out that Anthony's in Canada and not a hockey fan, which is sad for me. I'm a huge hockey fan watching the Four Nations right now. So
I saw the disappointment on his face when I said that. It just dropped. What? A Canadian doesn't like hockey? Well, I mean, okay. To be fair, man, I do like hockey. I do like sports, but I just don't watch them as much as I should.
Yep.
I still saw the disappointment. Yeah, Johnny's a big hockey fan. He was telling me a little bit earlier. Apparently, there's a big game coming up, U.S. and Canada. Let's see who prevails. I don't know. I think we can do it. I think we can take it this time.
I'm hoping not. I think
Yeah, I
I'm
think
hoping
so.
our lines are gonna beat guys. We beat the brakes off of Finland last night, 6-1. So
Not bad.
that was pretty happy to see that. That's a
Good
good
start.
stride going forward. So
Yeah.
yep.
Good stuff. Cool. Okay, well, let's jump into it then. I'm not seeing any questions in chat. So, as always, chat, feel free to drop questions as we go. We'll kind of pause whenever we can, but we will leave some room for a Q&A at the end. I'm going to go move over to the next screen now. Let's go to this one. So, Johnny, go ahead and share your screen. We should be able to see that live. Yeah? Nice. Good. Everyone in chat can see this as well? Yeah, I think so. I think you're good.
Cool. Awesome. Well, like I was saying, I really appreciate everyone having me here today. I know it's Friday. I know we're about to start the weekend. So thanks for tuning in and going through this. I'm sure everybody's ready for the workday to be over and kind of start the weekend. So a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Johnny Johnson. My parents were not too creative when it came to my name. They decided to use it twice in a row. And my Twitter handle and literally everything is JSecurity101. Trying not to judge that too harshly. I made that when I was like a freshman in college, and it just kind of stuck with me, and I never changed it since. So there's a lot cooler ones out there for sure. I kind of like what Anthony was saying. I am the principal EDR, Windows EDR product researcher at Huntress currently. I'm also the founder of Johnson Security Research LLC. It's just an LLC that I created to work with great companies like Level of Fact on training and do some consulting as well. Formerly, I worked at places like Spectre Ops, where I did a lot of detection engineering consulting, did some research over there as well, and Red Canary and Binary Defense, where I've also done research. When it comes to what I'm interested in when it comes to security, it's mainly Windows internals. It's going to be detection engineering processes. I really am a big fan of data collection and telemetry. Is there a way that we can extract telemetry in a way that people have been doing for a long time, but have not looked at it a certain way? So that's one thing I love doing. And reverse engineering malware, things like that, is always a blast. And as you can see, I've contributed to and authored some cool tools out there. The biggest one on there is JonMon. That is like a homebrewed EDR that I made. That's a big research project, so that's fun as well. And what do I like to do, like outside of the computer? Really, it comes down to hanging out with my dog and going hiking with my girlfriend. I like hockey quite a bit, and I liked golf. Golf just doesn't love me as much as I love it, so it's currently a love-hate game right now. But we're working on improving it. So that's one step at a time. So today we wanted to kind of dive into something called alert classification. This is pretty massive when it comes to SOC operations and methodology in general, right? Because at the end of the day, the SOC has, if not the hardest, one of the hardest jobs in all of detection and response. And it's because they're getting streamed with a whole bunch of alerts, a bunch of telemetry. They have to make decisions on the fly. Some people have certain SOLs. It's really tough. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to alert classification, right? Like depending on what tier you are, depending on the classifications you have in your organization, alert classification is going to help tell somebody, is something bad happening in your organization, or is what we're seeing not bad, right? And I kind of want to dive into this from a methodology perspective and then some practicality along with that as well, and then tease this new course that we're building at a level of fact that will dive into this way deeper than we're even going to touch here on the stream today. So with inside of classification, what is it? It's simply just like a process of assessing and categorizing alerts. So, as everybody knows who works in a SOC or anybody who works in security, you're streamed with these alerts and you kind of have to figure out, is this good or bad? And it matters for a lot of reasons. It helps determine, what caused the alert. What's the root cause analysis going on? Was this just a bad admin downloading PS exec and running it? Was it someone doing testing? Is it a legit adversary? Is it a red team? It also helps identify other activity that relates to the alert, right? So you might not every action is going to have an alert tied to it, but if you start to do further analysis and investigation on that host around what happened around that alert, you might be able to pick up on activity that you didn't see, and that would either help you, your organization, and or your customer. see that happened as well, which is a win. And that feedback loop could always go inside of detections, which in the future you would be able to pick up on it sooner than what you did, right? The potential impact of the threat. So what's the severity? Is this just some loader that's pretty bad? Is this ransomware? Is it a red team? All these things are gonna matter. And the output is alert categorization. So identifying if something is a true positive, false negative, etc., which we'll touch on here in a minute. Assign a severity level to the alerts. Now, typically when an alert comes in, you're going to have a severity level tied to it, and that's going to help determine where on the queue you're going to look at it. But it is important to help if you see something come in and you're starting to see this alert come in a lot, and it's maybe a high, and you're realizing there's a lot of false positives, and it's not necessarily letting you know maliciousness is happening on a host. That might be a good opportunity to change the severity, which is really important inside of SOCs that you don't often see. You don't really see a lot of that feedback loop. It's kind of like, great, queue, categorize, move on. And that feedback loop is super important to help get the alerts in front of the SOC that really, really matter. Recommended next steps. So do we need to investigate this, remediate it, escalate, dismiss? Is there automation in the future? It's like, hey, like this took a lot of manual analysis. Do we want to maybe automate some of that in the future? Right. And there's different classification levels. And this is super important whenever we go inside of alert classification, because ideally this is what you're going to be determining what each alert is, right? And so we'll dive into this a little bit. You have false positives, and this is like a benign event that's flagged as malicious. You have true positives, which are going to be a legitimate threat, and it was properly flagged as malicious. That's the most ideal thing, right? You have false negatives. It's an event that was expected to trigger an alert, but didn't. That's basically like you have a blind spot in your organization. You're not going to see that if someone does perform that activity. And then you have a true negative, and this is just correctly flagged non-malicious event, benign event. So those are good. But what you really want is the lower amount of false positives and higher true positives. Now, we're not always going to get that, unfortunately. And here's a good mapping of, if you've never heard of these terms before, what this means. So you have, predicted positive, actual positive, etc. And this is just a good way to look at this whenever it comes to that. But inside the SOC, ideally, like you kind of want a lot of true positives, in the sense of you don't want your organization to be attacked all the time. But when you see an alert, ideally it's like, hey, this is bad. But it's important to know these terms, because whenever you go through the classification process, you can't just like toss something off to the side and be like, okay, well, this is not bad, so I'm just going to move on. You have to categorize these properly and classify them, so that in the future, if it comes to like tuning for a detection, if it comes to determining if a detection is actually useful at all, identifying and classifying and setting these levels are going to be incredibly important. And then you have different severity levels. And this is, these classify alerts based on their potential impact to the organization or environment. And this is very organizational dependent. And this is also very subjective. And because what I might think is a medium based alert, Anthony might think is a low based alert. And so it's important to have these conversations internally of what matters to your organization and how do we want to move forward in setting these severity levels to these alerts or these detections, so that when they're passed over to the SOC, it's in the proper queue, right? And often what we see is a mismatch of expectation or clarification of what severity levels are, because some people, again, in the detection engineering might think something's higher, where the SOC's like, hey, this isn't that impactful for us and isn't giving us a lot of information of true maliciousness. Right, so you have informational, and this is going to be no immediate threat. Typically, it's a contextual alert. An example is like a who am I process activity, right? And again, this is all subjective. This is just when I was creating these slide decks and I was making these examples. But again, someone in the audience right now could be looking at this and be like, hey, in my organization, who am I doesn't happen a lot, right? We have like 2 admins and no one's really doing this. So this might be, let's say, a low or medium alert for some people, potentially, if you have a really locked down environment, no one's really doing that type of stuff, and who am I is commonly tied to like red teams or, actual adversarial behavior. You have low severity, which is unusual, but not necessarily tied to a malicious action all the time. It may further, further monitoring. It doesn't necessarily warrant immediate action. This is often also just contextual as well, meaning like if we see a critical, medium, or high, which I'll touch on here in a minute, we see one of those three and then we see a low, we can kind of start to build this timeline of different activity that happened from the point of initial either alert or execution or whatever it may be. And a good example of this is like run DLL launching PowerShell, or just like a user creation event, right? That's an example of that. And then you have medium severity, and this is potentially suspicious activity that requires further investigation. We're starting to get into okay, if a medium alert pops up in my queue, I need to be looking at it pretty closely, because a lot of medium alerts often are like on the brink of being high, but not necessarily at that point yet. And a good example of this is like WMI event subscription. A lot of persistent mechanism type things are going to commonly be in like the medium severity. Another good example of this is like suspicious scheduled task alerting. That's also another medium, because it could be persistence, or it could just be the random software you just installed that needs to persist or do something weird every time it starts up, right? It kind of goes back and forth there. We also have high severity, and this is going to be a strong indicator of a threat, meaning if there's a high alert that comes in, it means that usually the probability of that being bad is pretty high, but also the impact that activity might have in the organization is pretty high as well. Right now, I want to stop here real quick and state severity levels also are determined not only on impact, but on the false positiveness of an alert. So there might be an alert that's like, hey, if this happens in my organization, this could be bad, pretty bad, but it does have a high number of false positives. And that's where like further automation comes in. But I just want to, we're not going to necessarily talk about that in depth, but I just want to kind of like put that into your mind and plant that seed, because there's like one or two other smaller factors that lead into severity levels. But we are keeping this relatively high level for this broadcast today. High severity also requires immediate investigation. Sometimes and usually response actions, whether that is removing a key in the registry, deleting a file, stopping process execution, whatever it may be. And a good example of this is like finding like a dumping LSAS via like comservices.dll, someone leveraging that to dump LSAS, which is obviously not great. And that means credentials have been stolen for that particular box. So those are typically high severities. Critical severities, these are alerts with high confidence of being a true positive. This means typically this could be like a CVE. This could be, hey, this is 100% really, really bad for us, and we want to get this all hands on deck as soon as possible. It typically requires immediate escalation and response immediately, along with incident containment. And then you have a good example of this is like ransomware or even known malware execution. So like if you say like a Kira has been dropped and has the same binary, and like you're able to see that dropped and you see that activity happening, immediate. Hey, this is bad. That would be a critical severity. We need to get in there and kind of clean up that as fast as possible. You're going to see a lot less. Now, as we start to move up this ladder from informational to critical, what you'll find oftentimes is there's typically not a lot of informational. There's a decent amount. These are often, informational is often used as well as like a testing platform or a testing phase for detection. It's like, hey, I want to see how often this triggers, how well this goes. So I'm just taking informational for now. I'm not going to, actually trigger or have the SOC look at it. Oftentimes, SOCs don't really look at anything that's not, low to critical. Sometimes I see some SOCs not looking at anything that's anything but high and critical, and then medium if like they have time. So informational is often a testing playground for that. And what you'll find is the higher we go up in the severity, typically the lesser amount of detections that are implemented in that severity, meaning like if I have, let's say, 30 medium alerts, I might have often, 20, 25 highs and then 10, 15 criticals, because it's really hard to get like, hey, this is for sure bad, kind of stamped onto a detection. And it also depends on like what your false positive sensitivity is in your organization, which we are going to talk about today, classification process and automation process and all of that stuff. So there are those different components in there. So classifying alerts, in a perfect world, this is kind of what you would see, right? You would see very clean computer, hey, like everything's okay. But in the reality, this is what the SOC has to deal with. There's so many different alerts coming in. There are requests coming in from other teams saying, hey, why didn't you pick up on this? What's going on with that? If you classify something incorrectly, you're opening up a door for more malicious activity to happen inside that organization without anybody seeing it, because someone's like, hey, this so-and-so, they classified this as non-malicious or whatever, however you classified it. And so the SOC is often drowned. Very rarely do you have like the left side of the house where it's clean, pristine, and very smooth operations, unfortunately. So we kind of need to talk about signal to noise ratio, right? Because I talked about the different classification levels. I've talked about severity, but the question is like, okay, if I know that I need to classify an alert and I know that these are different severities, how do I put those two things together? And like, how does detection come in there? So we're gonna talk about signal to noise ratio. This is actually like a science and engineering concept that has actually been implemented inside of security, like many other concepts out there. And it's just a balance between useful and actionable alerts, which is a signal, and irrelevant or low priority alerts, so noise, right? High SNR is going to be alerts equal bad is happening, and a low SNR means alerts sometimes mean bad is happening, but there's a lot of noise there, and it's really hard to hear somebody. A good example of this is like, say you're in a room, right? And you're talking to somebody and they're across the room and it's just you guys there. Great. You guys can hear each other, no problem. So whenever they speak, you hear. But let's fill that room with now 200 people and everybody's talking. And you're trying to talk to that person and you get louder and you get louder and you get louder. And you see the lips moving, but you don't hear anything. That's because there's so much noise happening there. And that can be directly translated into SOC as well, because not only does SNR like matter in terms of like classification, severity, etc., but it also plays into something that which we won't necessarily dive into today, but it's alert fatigue. And whenever it comes to classifications, if the SOC is being swarmed with all of these alerts and they're having, okay, like I have an hour to like whatever the SOL is, whatever the timing is that you get alert in the queue and you have to classify whatever that time span is. It's almost like as soon as that comes in, a timer starts. And as that timer starts to wear down, you start to get more antsy. And it's like, okay, I have to figure this out. And that's why so many SOC teams are like, okay, I just need super high fidelity detections, which we'll talk about detections here in a moment. And that way, whenever I am faced with something, I am able to get this out properly. It's nice and clean, and the SNR is super high. However, it's just going to be very hard because many detections that we need out there are behavioral and broader. And so when you start to open up the gate a little bit, you're going to get more noise, which is why it is super important to have other processes in place before implementing behavioral broader alerts. And what we often find is people try to, what I like to call, have their cake and eat it too. And it's essentially, I want a small SOC team, not spend a lot of money on that, but we want to detect the coolest thing out there, like in memory, injection. And it's like, oh boy, you know what I mean? Like that's very hard to do. There needs to be processes in place, which we'll dive into here in a little bit. But this is why SNR is super important to understand whenever it comes to not only the volume of alerts that are coming in, but also in terms of what type of detections can you handle, because that's going to determine the noise ratio as well that's coming in. So the higher the SNR, the better, right? Like that's the most ideal state. And that's where we can go back to that picture of having a clean and pristine room and nothing else happening versus the everything's flying everywhere and it's kind of crazy. So why the noise? This is what I mean by processes, and it comes down to the basics, super basics. And I think oftentimes people try to do the really advanced stuff, but they forget the basics. So we have to ask ourselves, like, how are administrators navigating tasks? Are they leveraging PS exec internally? Are they using PS remoting? Like, how are they moving and navigating administrative tasks in the environment? Are you guys leveraging RMMs? If anybody here is a fan of an RMM, great. That's awesome. But RMMs introduce, and these are remote management tooling softwares, like they introduce so much noise in the environment, because what they do is they wrap underlying, like, say, Windows components, and they just execute that left and right, and it looks like bad activity. It really does. And so now you're stuck between this. Okay, you have this administrative thing that's being used, and it makes the administrative life easier, sure. But for the SOC, it's like, okay, well, how can we write a detection of, malicious lateral movement when we have an RMM that's already pinged into every box and then running net user, whatever it is? It makes it incredibly tough. You have software usage as well. What can you download? Can they download anything they want? Can they execute? I've seen organizations where I've seen like Steam on people's desktops for work, and I've seen like WoW Classic, all of these things that kind of look a little weird. And so it makes it tough. Least privilege, who has admin rights? I mean, these all sound like very basic concepts, and I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, yeah, I know. But this is really, we're about to jump into what detections are viable inside your organization and why. And this is where it really comes down to is, do we have the basic foundation set in place that's going to allow us to look at the more advanced stuff? Or do we need to stay at a more precision route? And identifying these things are incredibly important. Can you, like, for example, can you really write a malicious PS exec detection when everyone is running PS exec? I'll never forget one of my clients, when I was a detection engineering consultant, asked me this exact question. They're like, hey, we want you to detect malicious PS exec. We're like, sick, yeah, of course. And then we started to look into it, and they're like, oh yeah, by the way, a lot of our admins use PS exec, and we're not going to remove that capability for them. And it's like, sick, okay. That makes this a lot harder, These factors really help determine at what level detections are written and can be written. So let's dive into kind of what detection types are. Here is a very simple graphic, and this comes from Jared Atkinson. When I worked over there was this concept that we use to kind of describe this, and it's called the detection spectrum. And if you look here on the very far left, you see precise, low false positive, high false negative. And on the very far right, you have broad, which is high false positive, low false negatives. And this is a very simple graph, but it shows perfectly what we need to know in terms of where do you want to be. And I think if I were to show this to every random detection engineer, they would probably draw me a square on the right side of this graph. But then if I were to show this to a SOC analyst, they would draw me a square on the left third of this graph, because they understand the difficulties of an alert comes in and what can we do with it. And if we want, the further right that we go on this graphic, the more we need to have in place in terms of classification process, automation, triage, etc. Like, there is no other way around it. And what I often find is people will maybe take this, like, I don't know, like a third of this left, and that'll be their detection rules. And then they'll take another third, and that will be their threat hunting team. And the really far right stuff, no one really touches, right? Because it's like a good example of a far right thing, which I'll talk about here. I'll give another example in a moment. Is like, one thing that's pretty hard to detect is legitimate malicious service creation. And what I mean by that is, like, a malicious service that was created that from an adversary that's not like the normal PS exec service. It means just some plain Jane service, and it runs a binary that, maybe or may not be signed. Because whenever that is created, it's hard to determine whether that's good or bad. It's actually on execution that we learn that. And so those are the things that you start to see whenever it comes to this, right? So let's take an example of a very precise detection. And this would be Mimikatz.exe. And keep in mind that you've probably heard another term for precise when it comes to detection types as brittle. I try to stay away from brittle because I think brittle gives a negative kind of thought process towards that detection type. And I want to be very clear here. Precise detections have their place. They're incredibly important. If I was standing up a new detection engineering team today, we would start with the basics. We would start with precise detections. I would not start with broad, because precise detections do build the foundation, because it is low-hanging fruit. It is super valuable, right? So I just want to state that. So Mimikatz.exe is a really good example of a precise detection. And an even more precise detection is like the hash of one of the Mimikatz versions, right? Now, the key to precise, it means that it's so precise that whenever it comes up, okay, this is going to be bad, right? Now, there could be technically false positives with this. Like if I change my, basic binary to look like or to be named Mimikatz.exe, sure. But there's going to be a lower false positive with that. And with hashes, I mean, there's not going to be any, right? And so you see this, but then keep in mind that the more precise a detection is, the easier it is to bypass and move around it. And so this is where a lot of detection engineering teams get really, really stuck. And it's tough because organizations are really hard on them. It's like, what do you detect? Do you detect this? Do you detect that? They'll get with a red team. They'll get with a purple team. And they're like, out of all these different variants of, doing this thing, you saw 3 out of like maybe 8 of them. Right. And so then they're like, okay, well, we need to go more broad. But then the SOC, it's often a tug of war, because the SOC's like, no, we need to keep this down here in terms of false positives. A good example of like a very broad detection is like read process memory of LSAS. Now this might not be as broad as what I'm showing here, but there's like reading process memory of LSAS, like dumping creds. That's very hard to get, and that can also be very noisy, but there's ways to filter that. Like we're not going to dive into all of that. So it could not be this broad, but due to some filtering capability, but we're just not going to, this is all conceptual here. So bear with me, but that's another aspect as well, or task manager as well, like seeing other ways of dumping LSAS in a way that isn't process based, that isn't command line based. It is purely based off the action itself, right? And I think oftentimes what we see is the most value comes in this middle section, to be honest with you. We have our foundation, we have precise alerts that are, to the left of this, but a lot of great value can be found in the middle. And this is where we might often find what we call the best bang for buck. And this dives into a bunch of concepts like what is someone's detection strategy, et cetera. But that's different today than what we're talking about. But this is super important for the SOC and alert classification, because when it comes to classification, when it comes to identifying and understanding severity, we have to understand what the detection types are that are being fed inside of the SOC. Because if we don't understand those types and something gets interfaced with us right off of the rip, and we don't know what it is, and we looks very, very normal to us, we're going to ask the question, why did I see this? What's going on with here? And then also, what are the steps that you have to do to triage the alert? Because the more broad it is, like I mentioned, typically the more steps you have to take to determine actual maliciousness versus a precise detection. Right. So determining detection type, there's different steps here. And, one of them is telemetry collection, which again, we're not going to dive into today, but I would, it's one of my favorite topics. So I have to at least mention it once, but it's the quality and quantity of alerts depending on available telemetry data that's available to us. Now, what does that mean? It means that detection engineering is limited on the telemetry that they're allowed to obtain by whatever sensor they're using. And then in turn, the SOC is limited on whatever alert or detection the detection engineering team is providing. And so you see this funnel that happens down the pipe here of limitation upon limitation upon limitation. And so, you get kind of stuck in that sometimes, but that will help determine detection type. And the detection capabilities are inherently limited by, like I mentioned, the telemetry that's collected. You also have false positive tolerance. Now, this is a big SOCism. And what I mean by that is, what are the amount or volume of false positives that your team can handle? A lot goes into this. So much goes into this. And this means, what is the number of personnel that you all have? What are the tooling or the analysis process that you have implemented within the organization? What are your triage and response steps? Some of this automated, is it not? Do you have a proper feedback loop in detection engineering to say, hey, listen, for the past 2 weeks, we've seen this fire a whole bunch, or maybe the past day, whatever the threshold is, we need this tuned, and then they work on tuning it, right? And that would maybe help trim that false positive down. There's also concepts of like suppression and things like that. So the question often comes to SOC is, how many false positives can you handle, or are you willing to handle? And is the team willing to accept more false positives in order to catch more true positives? Meaning, are you willing to go further right on the detection spectrum there to see broader based, behavioral based activity in order to catch process injection, let's say? Or do you want to stay more left of that and stay in the more process command line world of like, okay, if I see Mimikatz run with this command line, then I know it's bad as well. And those are the questions that I think SOC really, really, really needs to have kind of in sync with detection engineering, because oftentimes they're on complete two different pages, which is really, really tough to see. Many, many teams will claim that their tolerance is medium to high, but is this truly the case, right? And how we figure this out is by asking a couple questions, which I'll ask here in the next slide. But I've talked to many SOCs before, and I've been like, what is your tolerance? And I either get one of two things. It's either, oh yeah, we're willing to catch the bad stuff, so like, just ship it to us and we'll figure it out. That's not a great answer. And then the next thing is, oh yeah, of course, like we can accept it. And then you start to feed it down, and it's like, hey, well, I didn't know you meant this many false positives. And there's commonly there's separation of communication there between detection engineer and SOC, which obviously causes a lot of issues. So if high, you should be able to implement more broad detections, obviously. And if low, then only precise detection should be implemented. And it is super important, like I mentioned, when it comes to classification, when it comes to alert fatigue, is communicating this with detection engineering and with whatever sensor that you're implementing inside your organization. And these are the questions that I commonly ask. Does your SOC have proper tools to navigate most alerts, right? Like, do they have access to VT, for example, virus total? Do they have access to, look at a binary in depth? Do they have access to tie process activity, like say registry activity or file activity? Do they have that capability? Or do they even have everything in a single pane of glass? Or do they need to click on 100 tabs in order to do that? Because the more work that it takes a SOC analyst to go dive into something, i.e. like open up a new tab, going to a section, retyping things in, that time is being spent on not on the actual analysis of the alert, and their SOL time is being completely, like, their whatever promise they have internally or externally, that is being absolutely just trimmed down. And that's not ideal, because if it's taking them, let's say theoretically 5 minutes to get everything they need up and running, and their internal promise is 30 minutes, well, now they only have 25 minutes to classify. And if this thing's getting hit with ransomware and they need to go through each thing, that's going to be really tough. How mature is your response process? Are you actually able to get in somewhere and stop an attack, or get more information about that, and start isolation? How many tiers does your SOC have? Sometimes you see just a flat SOC, and someone that I don't love that practice, I love a tier to a SOC, because tier 2s can train tier 1s and 3s to 2s. And, you have different tiers. Like your tier 3s might be close to threat hunters, where tier 2s help tier 1s to validate that something is malicious, or if something looks like a false positive and they need a second set of eyes, or tier 2s for. There's a lot of different ways to kind of, cut that cheese there, but you really need multiple tiers to your SOC. So I mentioned alert response times, and I kind of want to talk about this deeper, because this plays a huge part into classification. Because someone is rushed on a classification, the likelihood that they are going to guess versus validate is going to be higher. And so you hear these terms and metrics, and these are super important metrics, like mean time to detect. So what's your MTTD, for example? So like, let's say theoretically I have a collection, it comes down the pipe, and it takes, that data pipeline takes me, 10, 15 minutes to even hit a detection. What's your mean time to response? Meaning classification and do something with it. And if that's 45 minutes, or your promise is 45 minutes, the reality is you're commonly going to be anywhere from 25 to 45 minutes behind the actual attack. That is time that an attacker has to continue to spread. Right. So that's why that also plays a big piece to that as well. You also have dwell time. So time between initial compromise and detection. Can you go in there, clean it up, find the initial point of compromise? Did they persist? Are they able to continue doing what they're wanting to do? You might have cleaned up what you found in the alert, but were you able to find the initial compromise and do something with that? You also have faster response times lead to less damage and quicker recovery. I think that's most people understand that concept, and that's super ideal, where you respond faster and it leads to quicker recovery there. And then obviously the longer the dwell time, the greater the potential impact on the organization. A good example of this is like ransomware. If you're taking a long time to identify ransomware and someone is going through and just encrypting files left and right, you're really behind the ball there. And it's going to be really, really tough. And ideally you pick up on activity way, way sooner than encryption. And that's why dwell time is super important, because let's say theoretically you saw an alert, you stopped an attack and they didn't get to an encryption, but the initial compromise is still there, and they're able to tweak a couple little things and then reship it out. And then the response time is really, really low, and they're actually able to encrypt. And that's not ideal either. That's very, very bad. So helping classification, take the SOC200 course. No, obviously we'll talk about the SOC200 course, and we're going to dive into classification way, way deeper than what we did here today. But I do want to give some maybe tips and tricks if you're wanting, to rethink about classification organization today, rethink about kind of the strategy that you're implementing in detection types, et cetera. So I kind of want to give a couple things, but we're not going to give you guys everything because this is going to be taught in the class, actually. You want to define clear classification criteria. I was talking about this earlier, is what does a true positive, what does a false positive alert mean in your organization? I think oftentimes if I give an alert to somebody, I'm like, hey, what is this? And they're like, well, this is a, benign false positive or testing. People, a lot of times what you'll find is there are other classification, like subclassification. And it's like, okay, this was a false positive, but this is due to security testing. To me, that's a true positive. So I would take that as hey, this is a true positive. This was actually bad activity that came from a red team, but it's not something that we actually need to ship to a customer, right? Like we were able to see that and we're allowed to let them know, whatever it may be. And sometimes the customer wants to know if you see the red team, right? So these are all criteria that I think there's a lot of confusion around these inside of organization. This causes for a lot of confusion. So assign clear severity levels. What is the impact and the urgency of these alerts inside your organization? And that is partially determined on the types of detection types that you can implement, but also what is your organization, what matters to your organization, right? And that's going to be massive. If you're an AD environment, then like DC sync would be a high alert severity in my head for your organization, right? It's very organizational dependent. Establish escalation and triage procedures and make sure those workflows are very fluid. Implement playbooks, guide analysts. You want to ensure that high severity alerts are quickly escalated to the right teams. You want to make sure that whenever something is escalated, you have multiple personnel there to either help. Let's say, one person's out on lunch and you escalate it. And it's like, well, I can't wait an hour for them to come back. There needs to be an offset, right? There needs to be someone to offshore that too. You also measure and improve alert efficiency. So track false positive rates and adjust detection logic. I often find this is such a crux for so many organizations because an analyst might be like, hey, I need this detection tune. And it's like, well, why? It's like, well, there's a lot of false positives. Okay, where? What is it? There's not a lot of root cause analysis to find why is that false positive happening. There's not a lot of that, unfortunately. And so it causes a lot of issues. And so that feedback loop needs to be very, very pristine on, hey, we're seeing a lot of false positives for this process doing this activity or this user doing this thing. And it's like, okay, is there a way for us to update this detection to not have that issue? And then work with detection engineering instead of just tossing the team, then tossing it back. It just becomes a big bowl of spaghetti, to be honest with you. Conduct post-incident reviews to refine classification process. So if you have found bad stuff like ransomware, right, there should always be an out brief, meaning, hey, let's all have a meeting with every analyst that was involved here, and let's talk about this. Who first found it? How did you find it? Not only is that valuable for like refining the classification process, but it's super valuable for education because whoever is also there and maybe didn't see it or maybe misclassified something, they're able to learn from that person. So refining that process is important, but having an out brief. Okay, this was ransomware. This is what we saw. This is how I knew. These were the steps that I took. And be very analytical about that. I want to really tell people, like, stray away from it just takes time. Whenever we see something that is malicious, really get down to why you knew it was malicious so that you can pass that process on, because maybe that could have been automated or more telemetry could have been used to classify that just a little bit sooner. Feedback loops, like I was saying, incredibly important here. And if you miss something, take that as an opportunity to learn and grow in your analytical process. Don't take that as a means to beat yourself up. Analyst training. This is also a big thing that I do not see SOC teams doing often, is sending people to training, whether that's detection engineering training, whether that's analytical training. Provide regular training on evolving attack techniques, right? Encourage cross-team collaboration. Let someone from the SOC go sit with someone from Intel. Have Intel come sit with the SOC to see if there's anything they can do to maybe help those processes out. Same thing with SOC and detection engineering teams. Again, like sometimes DE teams and SOC teams are one team, but oftentimes they're not. They're two separate teams, and whoever is writing the alert or the detection is often not the one who is responding to it. And that's a big issue because what the SOC might need, the one team might not be giving, but maybe what the DE team is giving is what the SOC needs, but they just don't know it because there's not any knowledge transfer or educational transfer, which is imperative for this. So, SOC200. We are super excited to announce this course. I think, I've talked to Anthony about this quite a bit. And SOC200 is going to be a course that goes beyond basic alert triage, basic incident handling, and it's going to equip you with analytical processes of actual adversarial, like Tradecraft. It's going to be host and network based. So we will talk about analytical processes for multiple attacks that are on the host, for network based things. And we will be talking about how to bring those together. We're going to do this by learning how to analyze and correlate security events so that we do see the more sophisticated threat attacks. We're going to leverage threat intelligence, talk about how that can help improve workflow, make workflow more efficient, identify adversarial activity quicker, because what we're able to do is say, hey, we've seen this before and Intel was given this thing, and so we're able to tie, oh, this was Akira then, this is Akira now, which is super valuable, excuse me. Leverage advanced analysis tools for hosts, for binaries, for network analysis, etc. We also are going to dive into matter attack, TTPs, and adversary emulation. We're going to understand strategic methodologies for how to build and advance your SOC teams. What I would say is SOC200 is for the SOC analyst that is either a tier 1 SOC analyst now, anywhere from tier 1 to tier 3. You're either looking at growing within the SOC, you are looking at going from tier 1 to tier 2, tier 2 to tier 3, or you're a tier 3 analyst that's like, hey, I want to get into detection engineering potentially, and I want to refine some of these analytical processes so that if I want to make that leap, I can make that leap. Or you're a SOC manager just like, I kind of want to get my hands back in the weeds. Like, I have not had my hands in the weeds for a while, and I want to see what's out there. I want to see what adversaries are doing and playing with. And you want to play with the data, you want to play with the real world attacks. That's what the SOC course is going to be about. And we do have some other really cool courses coming down the pipe, which I'm excited to talk about with Anthony at some point, or we're going to announce as well. And they will be courses that are further down the pipe of SOC. So more detection response related, etc. So not talk about those too much, but we are cooking up some really cool stuff in the kitchen. So lastly, again, you're going to understand advanced SOC analytical processes, which is going to help improve analysis efficiency. So like things like alert classification, how do you deal with alert fatigue, all of these things. So again, if you're an analyst with any of those levels, you're a manager once you get your hands back in the field, this would actually be a really good course. You know, I didn't think about this till just now. This would actually be a really good course if you're a red teamer and you're like, hey, I want to see how people are responding to alerts, because that might help you out as a red teamer, or it might help you understand blue team operations, etc. This would be really good for cross training as well. So any questions from anybody?
Well,
and I'll kind of stop sharing here, Anthony, so I can kind of look at the chat too.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, first of all, what I'm going to say, let me go and move it over to the other screen over here. Yeah. So the first thing that I want to say, Johnny, was, I don't know if y'all in chat felt this, but I kind of felt like I was maybe I was like an MSP manager, or maybe like I manage a SOC and I just got a full consultation from Johnny. That's kind of what that felt like over there. There was a ton of information and insights to unpack and take away, and considerations on sort of like best practices. What do we want to do? How do we really evaluate the effectiveness of our SOC and our analysts? What type of technical intelligence and processes do we need to really improve things? So that was awesome, man. Very, very well done. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, like free consulting from Johnny as opposed to saying chat. Chat was really active, man. If you scroll to the top, there was actually quite a few good things coming, some good conversation.
Oh, cool. Yeah, let me take a look here.
Yeah. You want to call one out for you to kind of talk more about? Otherwise, I'm happy to kind of pull one out as well too.
If you could pull some out, for some reason my chat is not, it's like very, very lagged for me. So it's like just starting to get some in.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right. So I think going right back to the beginning, I think that's when things first started being. You know what? Let me scroll up on the actual chat window here inside of the stream too. 1 second. Let's go right over. Bleedus shot it right in the beginning. I think that's what really started cooking things off over here. Which is worse, false positive or false negative?
Oh,
okay, yeah, and that really there was a lot
that's
after
a great
that.
Question.
Yeah,
yeah, I would say, you know, I'll kind of give both answers here. I'll give an answer for whenever false positives are worse and whenever false negatives are worse. False positives can be very, very bad because it is introducing so much noise into the SOC where it starts to introduce other issues like fatigue. And, you know, that becomes a massive problem. And then what you find oftentimes whenever fatigue happens, analysts are just trying to get through everything as fast as possible. And it causes a big issue because if you're going through things as fast as possible, what you'll often find is you're going to miss the true positive. Now, false negatives. I hate to miss a false negative. I really do, because it's one of those things where if we're not able to actually pick up on the Bearder, like I said, this happened to one of our analysts recently. Yeah, it's it's okay to slow down. I agree with this 100%. I just want to pause on this. It's okay to slow down. I think it's often a selling point to teams or to customers where it's like, we have a really quick turnaround time. That's coming at a cost. You either got to have a lot of people, you got to have a very advanced process. But you got to, I always say this, you got to give your analysts time to cook. You got to put them in the kitchen and let them see what they come out with. And so that's a big thing. But yeah, when it comes to false negatives, I hate missing a false negative because it's like, oh, we could have done this way better. And we missed this big time. But this is where another concept that we will teach in another course down the road. We might toss it in SOC 200, but it's detection layering is super important. Okay. So if you do have a false negative, you do miss something, like hopefully you have something else there to catch it. You have a net that was put there. So that would be my answer. I know it's a very consulty answer. I'll give you it depends. But that is very tough.
Cool. Good. I'm just actually making a little stream thing here, like a little question box, kind of like we see in Restream stuff. There was another question over by Poo Chat. Do you think that metrics surrounding tickets or cases closed per analyst hour create bad processes?
To be honest, a lot of times, yeah. I think oftentimes what we find when it comes to that is yes and no. The consulting answer, it depends. It's tough because I just realized, by the way, that I have this yellow squishy that keeps coming up. It's a little thing that I didn't even mean to tear. It broke the other day. So if you keep seeing it, it's like a little thing. I have to do something with my hands.
I've got a lot of fiddly things on my desk too, man, in the same way. Yeah.
I tried to keep it below the camera, but what we often find when it comes to these metrics is that they're being used against the SOC team more often than they're used to build up the SOC team. And sometimes it's like, hey, our metrics are moving low, and so we need to get more people, so it could be used for hiring. But oftentimes it's, well, SOC's not doing their job. And it's like, okay, like, wow, thanks for that. So that's a very tough metric to keep a hold of. And I think it can be used to hold people accountable, but I think it can also be used as a misrepresentation of the process that's taking place.
Nice. Okay, cool. Well, I got another one as well too further up in chat. Not so much a question, but a comment from Fleetus here, and I think it's actually pretty good to talk about. He's just saying training includes day in the life. To be honest, and we know that. So, I mean, what's your take on how can we ensure that a training program, of course, like SOC 200, how do we ensure that something like that is able to at least provide or emulate some of that? Because yes, we know education is the best teacher, kind of thing, or as they like to say or paraphrase, right? But how do you really capture that inside of a course? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think what it is, it's bringing real world issues, real world problems, and trying to answer them inside of it. And then also showing the real world attacks. I really do think that a lot of classes out there will be like, hey, you could do this really cool thing. And then that's really hard to implement within somebody's process and organization. So it's breaking down the commonalities in terms of problems and trying to fix them day by day, but it's bringing the problem that you've experienced from the real world into the class and sharing that experience. Another really important thing when it comes to training is students being able to talk one-on-one with the instructor. And that is, hey, so we learned this today about alert classification, but we have a unique thing in our organization. What are your thoughts on this? And being able to apply that to a real world scenario at real time for a student is also incredibly valuable. So that's how bringing that training into the day in life is going to be incredibly, at least in my opinion, very impactful. And that's what we're going to do for SOC 200.
Nice. Cool. Got another question over from X Lazarg. Is there an estimated timeline for the course? When will it come out?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, I know. So to be honest with you, my hope for those, I'm going to Scotland in March. So I'll give you guys a little real time here. I'm going to Scotland in March. My goal is to have the course either completely tossed over to Anthony and us to start working on labs, or to be almost done with it. So I'm really hoping into March we are able to put a stamp on it and ship it. And
That's
this is going to
coming
be a
soon.
unique course, and hopefully it's okay I share this, Anthony. But this is actually going to be a course that we're going to do live versus on demand. It's going to be something where it's going to be either virtual like this, or it's going to be in person. It's not going to be on demand, so it will be real time with real instructors, which will be fun.
Yeah, I think it's
someone just
really
asked that question: is it live or self-paced? Yeah, it's going to be live.
Yep. Cool. Yeah. I think it's really important, kind of like the things that you were talking about, right? To have some level of guidance. We've had a lot of good reviews and responses from the CDA live training over the years. Obviously, 14 weeks is a lot at once. So I think this one's going to be packaged up a little bit shorter as well, too. It's not a 14-week training program, as I understand.
No. Yep.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, I think I captured some of those big ones over there up above the chat. So let's kind of scroll now to active chat right in the bottom. Any questions you want to ask Johnny? That was sort of like what we were talking about above. But what else would you like to address, everyone? What are your burning questions around the SOC, metrics, analytics, etc., processes? What do you want to talk about? Give everyone a moment
Toss
to
me
think
all the
about it.
questions. I'm more than happy to talk it. We could also talk about detection concepts as well. It's also a fun thing I like talking about. I know I hinted at some of it. I try to steer away from too much detection stuff today. How long did it take you to get to senior? That's a good question. I mean, I started as an associate consultant. I want to say it probably took me two and some change, but 2 years and some change. What I'll say is this: when it comes to that, is that's very arbitrary and subjective on your organization, the processes that you're doing. Consulting is completely different than being in house. So that's how long that took me. And then dogs in the background are making my day. Yeah, I 2 dogs. One is Sky. He's the big one, and then Harley is the small one. And I think she probably sees a bird, and it's going to take me pulling her away from the door to stop staring at it. So very object oriented.
Nice. Cool. Anything else anyone want to dive into? I think it was interesting talking about your so when you were presenting the precise versus broad detection, I think it painted a realistic view of where we can try to aim for instead of getting too much on either side of the coin, or rather the spectrum over there. What do you commonly see? You know, like you said, you've consulted, worked a lot of SOCs. Where do you think they average? Like, where do you think they land on that on average, and what are the challenges are? Kind of get to the goal. Yeah,
that's a great question. I often find okay, so I think there's 2 questions. So I think what I often see is, to be honest, more of the left side, more of the precise side, because I think when we start to ask the question of what do you want to see, what's your false positive, kind of sensitivity, all of those things, and those questions start to be answered more of the left side. So I would probably say a third to the right, all the way down left, leaving 2/3 to the right. And then, like I mentioned, oftentimes another third, maybe further than that, is often covered with threat hunting and those type of operations. What I really think is valuable is building a foundation on the left side, but being more towards the middle. If you can build out processes that are automatable and that are efficient, the middle is where you get the best bang for buck, because that's where you're going to see things like credential dumping, lateral movement. You're going to see things like privilege escalation, for example, certain privilege escalation options and things like that. That's where you're going to see more of that activity, which, if you think about an attacker lifecycle, that is really, 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 really where they're going to be. I mean, there's 4, I've said this on a stream before. There's 4 things that I really think, I call this the attacker lifecycle, that every attack, I mean, you can go back and quote me on this when it comes to threat reports. There are 4 types of tactics that are commonly used, and they are privilege escalation, persistence, credential dumping, and lateral movement. Yes, initial access happens, and it has to happen. The thing is, that's so broad on the spectrum because it can happen so many different ways. And so is it really valuable to spend so many resources on the initial access side versus, okay, well, they're going to do something, then I know they're going to do one of these 4 tactics, and then you start to break down those techniques. And that's where that middle of the spectrum really lives. And so I would say that's where the best bang for buck is there.
Nice. Yeah, makes a ton of sense.
If you're a smaller team, are there certain things that they should focus on versus a larger team? Absolutely. I would say if you're a smaller team, now I'm going to assume that you're saying a smaller SOC team. I would say the big thing there is making sure the tier levels are implemented well, communications implemented well, questions are being asked of, hey, I think this is a false positive, someone check me, whatever it is. But those processes are very fine-tuned. And if you're a smaller team, you probably do want to live on more of the left side of the spectrum in terms of precision, because that way that's going to allow you to get your team very efficient, very smooth, and it's not flooding them, because the smaller your team is and the more alerts coming in, the faster you're going to get flooded, the faster alert fatigue is going to happen.
Nice.
So there's that. And then if you are a team of 1, make friends with LOE and get them to okay, so, thanks for dropping my GitHub. And then what are some good practices for tier 1 SOC to give value to the engineers? Great question. Okay, so this gets into like some detection engineering. You really nerd sniped me is what I call it with this question, because this is a very this is
gonna go off.
That I think, yeah. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the people who are creating the detections are not always the ones that are responding. Now, oftentimes people who are detection engineers came from the SOC, but not always, right? And so there's a lot of assumptions that happen. Okay, alert fires, here's the information you'll need, let me ship it down the pipe. But if you're a tier 1 SOC analyst and you've never seen LSAS dumped before, and you see LSAS dump versus with comm service, it's like, okay, cool. Like, what do I do with this? And there's not proper response steps. There's not proper education inside of the detection in terms of like what this detection means. I think every alert needs to have some snippet of knowledge transfer in there. And how tier 1 SOC analysts can do is challenge assumptions, really, at the end of the day, because not only will it help them learn, but it's going to make processes for the future detections even smoother. So, before I get into that rabbit hole too much, that's my answer to the question. But I do love that question. It's such a good question. So
nice.
Yep.
Yeah, I think a lot of analysts, when they first get started in the SOC, they're immediately thinking, yeah, like how can they start giving back? Like how do they start getting themselves out ahead of that position as well too? So good coverage.
Yep, absolutely.
Who's saying most SOCs have been around long enough that they don't know the origins or how things work. Yeah, so it's kind of like the old ship of Theseus kind of thought experiment right here, right? Like the SOC's been around and it's been sort of disassembled and rebuilt with different people coming and going. Is it the same SOC that it once was when it first started, right? Things kind of change. Things get lost in the sauce.
Yep. And that's tough. That's incredibly tough, because as things get rebuilt over time, you might have a lingering manager or analyst. It's like, oh, well, this is how we did it back in the day. And it's like, well, that's not how we're doing it now.
Yeah.
And so another thing I would really challenge analysts is always have a yearn for learning and optimization, because if things get rebuilt and they get rebuilt well, that's really, really, really going to help your life, but also help you grow. And then also the cool thing is the more you get to see of what's working, what's not working, so that you can give your opinion on that, and then that will help you grow in the SOC as well. Documentation is absolutely key. I agree with that. I think that is so lost, because you might have an analyst that's been there for 4 years and he or she's like, great, I'm going to go be a threat hunter, and they either leave or they go to a different team, and then everybody else is left like, so how did they do this? And then it causes a lot of issues. Yes, and validate documentation is massive as well.
Yeah. Yep. They don't have to reflect the current reality.
Absolutely. Can't tell how many times I've looked at documentation that was like 3 years old, and I'm like, does this actually still work this way? Because I highly doubt it.
Yep. Like last updated by so-and-so a couple years ago. Yeah. Meanwhile, we're not even using the same tooling anymore. Yeah. It's a challenge. Yeah. Any other questions you wanna go over with Johnny over here?
Visio is how people people think it's built. Yeah.
Yeah, network diagrams. Yeah, versus reality.
Oh yeah.
How it started versus how it's going. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the cool thing about, I think, and that's another thing. Keep this in mind too. And this will be something we'll talk about in SOC 200, is always be okay with evolving. I think oftentimes you might have someone who's done it for 15, 20 years and they had a certain way that they did it. That's awesome. But technology changes. And because of that, we have to be willing to evolve our methodology and our thought process so that we can change with technology and so that we're actually able to pick up on the real threats. And I think that is, that's massive. So experience is massive, but in my opinion, being willing to learn on the fly, be flexible is incredibly massive as well. Yeah. Valuable.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, the threats that a SOC analyst would be dealing with, sort of like on average or common threats a year ago versus today, heck, 6 months ago from today, is going to be changing rapidly outside of the basics, of course, that we see of various attack patterns.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and what we often find too is there's often Tradecraft will change, at least in the red team world. This maybe not for adversaries. I mean, adversaries will change too, obviously. But you might have like 1 year where like all these red team tools are coming out for RPC, and then another year where everyone's like, oh, WMI. And I think oftentimes is those are chased after in terms of detection and alerting. Are we actually picking up real threats with that? And so being able to follow real threats over time is very, very valuable, which is why you need a good intel team in order to help you out with that. So,
I mean, hopefully you have an intel team, right? I mean, if you're at a small MSP, you're probably just going to be wearing a couple different hats.
Yeah. Any opinions on AI-Augmented detection triaging for it? Yes. To answer that question, I think there's a lot of value in leveraging AI tooling in order to help. Now, I want to be very specific in this. It's not going to solve the problem, but it's going to help evolve and make the problem quicker, as long as you are testing the AI and not using it for big tasks. You're leveraging it for the smaller tasks that it's shown over time, because you're now this is another thing, man. This is also a great question. This is also something we'll talk about SOC 200. When you introduce a decision maker, you're introducing a decision maker that could get it wrong. And so if you're implementing an AI tool on helping triage and do things, and it gets it wrong, and it never actually got escalated, and an attack was able to get through the filter, that's really tough. And so that's equally on the analyst as it is the tool, because the analyst and the team implemented that tool. So test the tools, identify where it's wrong, and then try to only apply it to situations that it is getting right. And often what we find is there's AI tools being out there and people are just trusting it. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people just toss code in ChatGPT and then try running it, and it's absolutely wrong. So you can't just blindly trust AI.
Yeah.
So
it's a tool. Just got to learn how to leverage and use it, right? I think Matt in Discord even dropped a link earlier. CrowdStrike released an article yesterday. CrowdStrike's Falcon Complete Next Gen MDR apparently comes with Charlotte. It's called Charlotte AI Detection Triage, and it's a 98% agreement rate with Falcon Complete's human expert triage decision making for tier 1 level of alerts. So the tooling is definitely getting there, right?
Oh yeah.
But again, 98%. So it's kind of what you were just saying over there, Johnny. Is like it's going to get it wrong. So
yeah, and that's the thing too, is I think oftentimes what you find is there are some tools out there that want to get something out AI related, because AI is really big right now.
Yeah.
For marketability, but maybe the product just isn't quite there yet. And that's why there's importance in testing.
Yep. Yeah, don't trust vendor metrics. Exactly right. Yeah, it's massaged, right? So 98% agreement of what? Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, good stuff. That's right, opposing why the answer is always going to be something in SOC 200. You want to know more? SOC 200, yeah.
The problem with me is someone will ask me a question that I really, really like, and then I'll just like go down this rabbit hole of answering the whole thing, and then it's like, oh, well, rip.
Nice. Cool. Okay, anything else? Anything else y'all want to ask? Otherwise, we can start wrapping up a little bit earlier, maybe, I think, instead of trying to pull the questions out. It seems like everyone's got some really good insight of what the session was about today. More questions in SOC 200? Okay, Katrina, yeah. Oh, sorry, Karina. I don't know why I said Katrina. Karina.
Yeah, the duration of SOC 2. So, yeah, so this is, we're shooting for a 4-day live course. So it's going to be 4 days. There's going to be in-depth practical labs. There's also going to be a capstone. So not only are we going to be teaching and walking through things, but there's going to be a time where it's like, great, cool, dive in and ask us questions and things like that. So yeah, 4 days live.
Much more digestible.
Yep.
Cool. Anything else? Otherwise, going once. CI, yeah, that's really short. You know what? Everything's relative, right? I think a 2 to 3 day weekend or 4-day course like this, just drill down on a module, can be really, really valuable. Not everything needs to be like a beginner A to Z type of course kind of thing, right? Like you look at CDA, like it's the full gamut. Even SOC 100, it's a broad, extensive course. But then after that, you should really start moving in on focusing, just like, okay, I'm just going to like drill down on a domain, on a module, on a topic, on a skill area, on a task like skill that I need to be able to have. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing I have found too, when it comes to courses like that, to Anthony's point, we want to drill down into concepts. We really want to talk about what works, what doesn't work, and we really want to be analytical and methodical about those processes. And so that's why we want to do a 4-day live course and bring that. And keep in mind, when I say live course, it's not like it's an hour or two a day. We're shooting for
it's full day.
It's a full day.
Yeah.
So that's what we're shooting for.
So Zephyr, you're part of the product team and some stuff surrounding the space. Oh, that's cool. Feel free to share more if you can. That'd be interesting.
Price point, I don't think we've necessarily narrowed that in yet. I think we have like a range, but we haven't necessarily narrowed that down yet.
Yeah, still kind of working that out. But we're gonna have some news coming in the coming weeks, talking more about that, a little landing page and such. But yeah, like Johnny said, right, March I think is sort of like when you're targeting, so it's coming up soon, real soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was actually just working on it last night.
Nice.
While watching the Four Nations.
Yeah, there you go. Somehow I feel like I'm going to be learning a lot more about hockey with Johnny around as well too.
Well, I'm going to start asking you a lot of questions, and I think you're going to be like, ChatGPT, what happened during the Four Nations game last night?
That's right. Cool. Okay, well, that being said then, I think we're kind of coming up to the end of our Q&A kind of period. So thank you everyone for spending your Valentine's Day Friday with us over here at Level Effect, and hopefully you've got some plans either for yourself or with someone else and enjoy the rest of that occasion. But Johnny, thank you for putting this together. I think there was a lot to really glean from this. Like I said, it's kind of felt like a free consultation if I was a SOC or an MSP type of manager. I think there's like a ton that I could just start thinking about just from this presentation alone and what you covered. So I really appreciate you putting that together. And I think, judging from the chat, I think everyone else did too. So from all of us and the chat, thank you.
No, yeah, absolutely. And thank you everybody for having me today. I'm super stoked to, do this class and other classes with Level Effect. And it's great to meet all of you all. I am in the Discord. So if there's any questions, please reach out to me. Whether that's, like I said, Discord, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever it may be. More than happy to chat, nerd out, whatever it may be. So thank you all very much.
Awesome. Thank you again, Johnny. And everyone else, thank you. And enjoy the rest of your Friday. We'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is our SOC 100 stream. It's 10 to 2. I think it's going to be a little bit short of that, but 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll see you tomorrow for SOC 100-3 kickoff, virtual SOC. So the stuff that you need to learn and be able to do before Johnny's content. We're going to be opening up the virtual SOC to all of you tomorrow. You're going to get your first taste of working with case management and tickets and all that good stuff. And then you're actually going to appreciate a lot of things Johnny's talking about, even hear a lot more. So we'll see you again tomorrow morning. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Friday, and we'll see you then.